Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I got a chance to meet Valparaiso students, I guess for the first time, at least the first time that I knew of, last month when some of the Civic Reflection Group came to Bloomington and put on a very successful program there. So I'm so glad to be here. My one hope when I agreed to come today is that I would get some lake effect snow, and that has come true. So everything after this is just icing.
So sweet.
All right. Well, let's start by talking about water. March 22nd was World Water Day. As they have for 24 years, the United Nations hosted events across the globe to raise awareness about the global scarcity of fresh water and the importance of water for lives and livelihoods. Besides the worldwide press campaign, which you could have seen online, there were in-person events in Paris, The Hague, New York, Bangkok, and Tajikistan. Although it probably doesn't know so, the UN also had supporters in Conyers, Georgia, where a group called Wells of Hope International has spread the message about clean water, citing statistics from the UN itself, on a budget of less than $25,000 a year since 2006. The leaders of that group are a retired couple, married couple, who are members of an Assemblies of God church. Wells of Hope got its startup money when the wife sold her large collection of Coca-Cola memorabilia. She explained, "If Jesus can turn water into wine, he can turn Coca-Cola into water." Today, I want to talk about another kind of transformation. Not the transformation of water into wine or Coca-Cola into water, but the transformation of global humanitarianism from something done by large agencies associated with government, or the UN, or religious denominations, into work taken up by congregations or even individuals. We're now in an era of what the columnist Nicholas Kristof called DoItYourself Foreign Aid. In the last 3 decades, more than 10,000 new international organizations have been set up by Americans looking to improve lives in the global south. And as many of you know, these formal nonprofit organizations are joined by thousands more short-term missions projects, as well as informal social entrepreneurs. These are people working individually, but more often in small groups to implement a host of programs that range from women's empowerment, to digging wells, to training African surgeons. Their specific projects vary, but what these groups have in common is their ability to work directly, grassroots to grassroots, bypassing the larger bureaucracies of aid that have come to dominate development projects since World War II. So in a way that has not yet been possible in history until now, the materially rich can reach directly to the poor, even across continents and oceans. And it's not hard to sense the possibilities here. Globalization has eased the flow of people and goods across borders. Compassionate individuals no longer need to wait for their national government or even the blessing of their religious denomination in order to take action for the poor. Instead of being bound by the economic stratification that is increasingly built into our geography, rich among rich, poor among poor, American generosity can reach the world's very neediest. But there are perils here too. When charity gets easier, justice can get harder. The complication of strangers' lives look much simpler at a distance. And the difficulties of politics, of compromise that happen when we live side by side with the disadvantaged can be avoided when we're working in a distant community and have the choice to just get on a plane and go home when things get unpleasant. Americans working abroad are not subject to the give and take, and that absence, I think, can make us increasingly impatient of the messiness of democratic life here at home. So my talk today has 3 parts. In the first, I'll talk about how we got to the era of do-it-yourself aid, and in the second, I'll discuss what role religion plays in it. Finally, I want to talk about the possibilities and perils of this era, and consider how young people with good hearts and good minds can help us embrace the possibilities and avoid the perils. First, let's think back in time to about 150 years ago, to the late 19th century. What did everyday Americans' engagement with the global South look like then? As many of you know, this was the high era of American religious missions. The largest religious denominations had formed boards, missions boards in the early 19th century, and independent agencies followed suit later on. In 1887, a handful of enthusiastic college students, calling themselves the Student Volunteer Movement, went on a barnstorming tour of American college campuses. They called for volunteers to effect the evangelization of the world in this generation. That wasn't achieved, but the goal of putting missionaries in Asia, the Pacific, and Africa was. So by World War I, there were at least 128 American-based Protestant missionary societies working abroad. Over time, the projects of many of these societies shifted from pure evangelization to providing services in education, medicine, and agriculture. And of course, as some of you know, this led to big schisms among Protestant denominations as well. But when the world wars came, American religious groups were accustomed to funding these kind of humanitarian practices. Many of the religious agencies we know today date to this era. Lutheran World Relief, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and Catholic World Services all date to this era. After the Second World War, these organizations turned relief projects in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Their work continued rather quietly for 2 decades, supported mostly by private contributions and a bit of food aid from the US government. This was really the era of high modernization theory and economic development. The US government devoted its money to building infrastructure and industry in the global south in hopes of keeping those countries out of the thrall of communism. But in the background, religious relief and development agencies were quietly expanding their budgets and their portfolios. Evangelicals launched their own agencies in these years as well, like World Vision and then Samaritan's Purse. And as the Cold War dragged on and then flared up badly in Vietnam, the US government became disgruntled with a development program that centered on direct aid to foreign governments. In the early 1970s, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee outlined a proposal to de-emphasize infrastructure building and focus instead on basic human needs. And instead of putting their money directly to unreliable foreign governments, money would be sent increasingly through non-governmental organizations. The private agencies that had been critical during and after the wars, again, took a prominent role in bringing American compassion to the global south. Some of these organizations, like World Vision, have become highly professionalized aid agencies that now compete with other NGOs for government contracts. These organizations are no longer cloistered within denominational traditions. Instead, they're part of the professional field of aid contractors that includes both nonprofit and for-profit agencies. This means that they are integrated into networks of Washington officials, that they have bureaucratic structures that can meet the complex reporting requirements of the government funders. But traditional missionary agencies continue to thrive. Some of them support thousands of missionaries on budgets of tens of millions of dollars a year. But while these transnational agencies hum along, individual congregations are increasingly choosing their own projects and own partners abroad. The sociologist of religion, Robert Wuthnow, who you heard about, found this fact among the hundreds of congregations he studied in 2009 for a book on the global reach of American Christianity. An immigrant member of a congregation, for instance, will set up a partnership between his new church in Philadelphia and his old church in Nigeria. Or a denomination might sponsor an exchange trip between pastors, and then the pastor might return to a Latin American community with a short-term mission team from her church. Some of the bigger faith-based NGOs have recognized this trend and have embraced it as an opportunity rather than a threat. For instance, the staff of World Vision helped a congregation in North Carolina set up a special project in Zambia. The congregation provided funding to care for 500 orphans in the community. They also went on to send short-term missions teams and provided support for education, water, and micro-enterprise projects in the village. Given that aid agencies and faith-based NGOs and mission agencies now have better trained staff and are smoother running machines than they've ever been, why do American congregations choose to do it themselves? Wuthnow found several reasons. First, people felt as though giving to projects they could choose and have some control over felt more voluntary and less like a tax. Church members felt as though the money was used more efficiently because it went to buy bricks and mortar abroad instead of financing salary and benefits of staff at home. The church leaders that Wuthnow interviewed also talked about relationships. The Americans felt satisfaction at seeing tangible change in people's lives, and in building personal relationships with the beneficiaries of the aid. One American leader said, "This is what Jesus would have us do. It causes people to feel in touch with God's love." Congregations' direct action is only one facet of the do-it-yourself aid movement. My own research is centered on roughly 10,000 new nonprofit organizations set up since 1990. Today, every state in the union and 1 out of every 3 U.S. counties is the home base of a registered international aid organization. To make sense of this expansion, we have to realize that most of these new groups are more like Wells of Hope than like better-known NGOs like CARE or Catholic World Relief. These new groups rely largely on volunteer labor and donations from individuals rather than contract revenue or foundation grants. IRS records tell us that the median organization has an annual budget of $25,000 a year or less. It's not until we get to like the top 10% of international aid organizations that we're looking at annual revenues of $1 million or more. The groups I'm most interested in are what I now call GINGOs, Grassroots International NGOs, or Grassroots NGOs. I'll use them interchangeably. These groups are typically personal projects launched by Americans who usually have a college degree, but no training or professional experience in international development. Adoptive parents who want to provide extra help to their child's native town abroad. MBA students who want to try out an idea for improving small-scale farming. An immigrant who wants to set up a school in his home country. 50 years ago, a few of these intrepid souls might have joined the Peace Corps or become missionaries, but most of them probably would have sent checks to large humanitarian organizations or just put it in their church offering plate. What's changed in the last 3 decades is that cheap travel and instant electronic communications with the things you all have in your pockets have made it possible for amateurs and part-timers to launch their own development projects. So technology has changed, that's part of the story. But geopolitics and patterns of immigration matter too. Thanks to the end of the Cold War and various civil wars, whole swaths of Africa, Central America, and Asia opened up to tourists by the 1990s. This was also the point when the real price of airline tickets was declining in real dollars and the income, at least of white-collar Americans, was increasing. The 1965 immigration reform had also swelled the population of highly educated Chinese and Indian immigrants, who by the turn of the millennium had the means to travel back and forth to their countries of origin, and in many cases had teenage or grown children who were taking an interest in those places. Immigrants and tourists alike could soon communicate with acquaintances abroad as the reach of the internet and mobile phones extended first to cities and then to rural provinces. So what we have is a context in which Americans can travel relatively safely and relatively cheaply to less developed parts of the world. Most often the travel is related to tourism, study abroad, or volunteer work through existing partnerships, often through universities or civic groups like the Rotary Club. Aid projects are then started to provide assistance to specific communities that Americans encounter during these travels. This is a critical point. Grassroots aid doesn't trickle down from a national development scheme, nor is it usually a broader aid intervention in search of the right site for implementation. Instead, grassroots aid emerges in a personal, relational context. What is it that do-it-yourself aid givers actually do? One of the things we know about large aid agencies is that they have significantly shifted their projects over the last several decades. David Korten, who was for many years an officer at the Ford Foundation and is one of the most insightful analysts of NGOs, wrote that there were 3 generations of NGO work. The first focused on welfare, or providing goods and services. The second focused on what we might call development or capacity building. This was about local communities identifying their problems and working together with outside collaborators to find solutions. Third generation of work reduced the role of outsiders more still and centered on large-scale political mobilization to change the institutions that kept people powerless. When Korten wrote about these 3 generations of NGO work in the early 1980s, he already saw those first-generation strategies of NGOs as providers of welfare services as being outdated. So it came as somewhat of a surprise when I started looking at grassroots NGOs that most of their work would be labeled by Korten as first-generation projects. The most common activity of grassroots NGOs, does anyone want to take a guess? Hunches? What do you think they do?
Water wells.
Okay, water wells is number 3. Number 1 is scholarships and building schools. Number 2 is medical supplies or supporting a medical clinic. Number 3 is water. So even if we were to put training for small business projects into the second generation strategies, which I think is sort of a stretch, about 3/4 of grassroots NGO focus on first generation projects. Most of the Americans who assist disadvantaged communities through grassroots NGOs are, in other words, providing the kinds of goods and services that people in wealthy countries get either from their family or from the state. In an interview, one leader of a grassroots NGO was completely explicit on this point. She said, it's really stepping into the gap of what the government can't or won't do. Let me turn from what grassroots aid organizations do to the role of religion in these organizations. Remember, these are groups explicitly set up as relief, development, or human rights organizations. One of the strange features about our laws involving nonprofit organizations is that churches and missionary societies don't even have to register for tax-exempt status. They automatically are granted it. All the groups I studied deliberately chose to incorporate themselves as international development groups. So one of the striking findings of my research is that even though many of these organizations described themselves as secular or rejected the label of faith-based organization, the place of religion in them was pervasive. Let me provide an example. I interviewed a woman I'll call Natalie, who founded a grassroots NGO I'll call For Kenya's Tomorrow. I asked her at one point in our conversation why she didn't think of her group as a religious organization. She told me, when I founded For Kenya's Tomorrow, I purposely did not found it as a religious organization for a couple of reasons. It comes with a certain connotation, I guess you could say. And I didn't want anyone who wanted to come and serve to feel left out. You know what I mean? Whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or whatever, I wanted it to be an open door for people to come and serve, not limited to any type of religion. And I also felt too, like in my conversations with God, that God was just saying to me, there's so many Christian organizations that are out there doing things in my name that aren't a true representation of who I really am. So just lead by example. And that's kind of how I felt about it too. Natalie illustrates the difficulty in designating an international aid group as religious. Both Natalie and her husband, Kenyan husband, are Pentecostals. Her mother-in-law is the pastor of a small Nairobi church that is the key partner for the group's aid activities. The bulk of the group's funding comes from Natalie's childhood church in Michigan. If you read the newsletter to see what's going on with them, these successes are punctuated with the exclamation, "Praise Jesus." But despite all this, Natalie doesn't describe For Kenya's Tomorrow as a faith-based or religious organization. For her, to be a religious organization is to restrict volunteering to those that share the same faith or that offer its services only to fellow believers. It also suggests that an organization is claiming a divine mandate for its work, doing things in my name. She fears that Christian groups abuse this mantle. To be more authentically Christian, then, is to reject the label of religious, but to, quote, lead by example. For Kenya's Tomorrow defines itself as a secular organization, even though religion shapes its programs, its partners, and its leaders' decisions. So rather than thinking about an organization as religious or not, and the people who run it as religious or not, I argue that it's most useful to think about the kinds of resources that religion affords. We can think of certain parts of religion as being tools in a sort of cultural toolkit that the leaders of grassroots NGOs sometimes bring out and use for particular jobs. I want to mention 3 categories of tools. First are frames, or ways of thinking and speaking about relief and development that imbue it with legitimacy. Next are modes of action that link the NGO, supporters, and local aid recipients. Third are networks of congregations and individuals that provide goods, personnel, and entree into aid-receiving communities. Even grassroots NGOs that would not describe themselves as religious, and probably even then outsiders would not describe as religious, still use some of these tools. Let me talk about these tools one by one very quickly. When I say that religion offers the leaders of grassroots NGOs frames, I mean that it provides ways of organizing and making meaning of the problems of poverty. When grassroots NGOs use religious frames, they highlight religious justifications for charity and sometimes for particular projects or classes of recipients. Other religious discourse can suggest a calling or divine sanction to a group's work. When I examined a random sample of the websites of grassroots NGOs, which by the way is how you have to get a lot of the information because they're too small to publish annual reports, I found that about a quarter of them justified their work by saying that it was God's will or a demonstration of God's love. Here's an example from another grassroots NGO that digs wells. This one is called Living Water International. For Living Water, it's all about Jesus. It's about demonstrating God's love, announcing his kingdom, seeing Jesus in the least of our brothers and sisters, offering a cup of water in Jesus' name and proclaiming his gospel, the living water. Helping communities create sustainable water, sanitation, hygiene, and Christian witness programs in partnership with local churches is the best way we found to do that. Why? Because the water crisis affects poverty, women, health, and education. And for us, it's a spiritual issue. The NGO's name and this text refer to two passages in the Gospel of John where Jesus speaks of living water. If anyone thirst, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water. That's John chapter 7, if you're following along. The group uses claims from development experts about the effect of water shortages on women, health, education, and poverty. But using the phrase living water invokes the ministry of Jesus and suggests to the reader that digging wells is in continuity with that ministry. This allusion, with an A, not I, is what allows the group to say, for us, it's a spiritual issue, and to enlist supporters on the basis of the project's religious bona fides. Using religious framing can also extend the boundaries of what we might think of in the Christian tradition as typical charitable action. Projects that can't be directly linked to a biblical text can still be framed as an expression of God's love. We can see this in the discourse of an NGO doing women's enterprise projects. One maker exists to be a tangible expression of God's love to poor women and girls vulnerable to trafficking and other exploitation by giving opportunities through education and business ventures. We provide educational sponsorships to girls in poverty, believing that their God-given potential is a treasure and should be developed. In this text, potential, intellectual and economic, is a gift from God, and programs that support that potential are an extension of God's love. These kinds of framings help Americans look at the complex problems of poverty and see a place to start. They can also give potential supporters confidence that an NGO's work is morally valid, or hope that the work will find divine favor and succeed. The second tool that religion provides to grassroots NGOs is human networks. Religious networks play critical roles for grassroots NGOs in finding partners in the global south and in recruiting supporters here in the US. NGO websites suggest that other than NGOs, religious congregations in either the aid receiving country or here in the United States were the most common organizational partners. This is in part because churches are the most common nonprofit organizations in the US and are the ones that Americans are most likely to belong to. But there's also something here of the history of colonialism and missions that is wrapped up into religion. This means that churches have existing networks that span the globe. For instance, the global reach of the Lutheran Church extended through migration and colonization to the Midwestern United States and to Tanzania. One of the people I met in my research was a Tanzanian immigrant I'll call Erasto. As a teenager, he was the first student in his village to be admitted to secondary school, which in Tanzania happens through a process of competitive exams. And eventually, he won a scholarship to attend Luther College in Iowa. He married an American woman from St. Paul, and eventually the two of them decided to raise funds to set up a secondary school in Erasto's home village in Tanzania. Their friend suggested that they meet with a local Lutheran minister who traveled several times to Tanzania through a sister church program. They met with the guy and soon developed that the pastor had not only visited Erasto's village, he had met his mother. This pastor's church then became a dedicated donor to this school, and until the school was legally incorporated as an independent nonprofit, The money was all wired through the St. Paul area synod. So there's an example of a project that isn't intrinsically religious, where the leaders that started it didn't use religious framing to describe their motivations, but the religious networks were absolutely critical in giving this NGO its start. Religion offers grassroots NGOs a third tool: religious modes of action that generate resources for the group, or that provide shared activities for Americans and aid recipients. Here are the many things that people learn to do, the practices that they develop in religious life, whether it's making music, praying, or giving money, are deployed for the good of aid projects. One religious practice of giving harnessed by NGOs is the Muslim obligation of zakat. There are several forms of religious charity mandated in the Quran, and 2 NGOs that I studied advertised their projects as a means for Muslims to acquit their obligations. One NGO allows donors to designate their contributions as zakat al-mal, which are alms given as a tax of one's wealth to the poor, or as zakat al-fitr, which are alms given on the holiday of Eid al-Fitr. With the funds they raised, these groups carried out education and sanitation projects and also delivered food aid during Ramadan. In another departure from the playbook of professional NGOs, nearly 1 in 6 of the groups I studied used their websites to ask supporters to pray for them. In these texts, prayer is often presented as a way for those who are unable to volunteer overseas to still support the organization. In some cases, readers are encouraged to pray about how they can best contribute to the organization, which makes prayer a stepping stone to further commitment. Prayer also serves as a bridging mode of action between Americans and people in aid-receiving communities. NGOs told me that prayer walks were one of the activities that American volunteers shared with African partners. A small group of Americans and locals would set out on foot in a neighborhood, calling on each house and asking if they could pray with them. A group called Wellsprings operates in a Ugandan town that has a slight Muslim majority. And one informant told me they make calls in both Muslim and Christian households. She said, "We just pray together. Muslim, Christian, it doesn't really matter. Very few people don't want to be prayed for." Clara, a 22-year-old American woman who volunteers for Kenya's Tomorrow, told me that prayer walks and Bible studies were the main tasks on which she was able to collaborate with young Kenyan men. The young men knew the neighborhood and provided local knowledge and safety to the volunteers. The walks helped the volunteers meet neighbors and understand local conditions, which would help them carry out future work. I also had the impression that these young Kenyan men didn't really mind spending time with these American women visiting. But these bridging modes of action help grassroots NGOs reinforce religious networks by building trust and providing a starting point for on-the-ground collaboration between Americans and local partners. Yet other NGO volunteers believe that there are religious modes of action that could damage their organization's goals. 2 of the doctors working for the Rwanda Ultrasound Initiative described themselves as personally religious, but they drew a firm line between their own beliefs and any expression of religion in the delivery of medical care. The founder of this organization had seen such behavior among other organizations and disparaged it as a bartering system, medical care in exchange for being proselytized. These volunteers rejected the language of mission. Said one, "Of course, there's very good things that missionaries have done, but we're not in that day and age anymore, so I think you have to be a little careful." Her comment about the age of missionaries being over might not be empirically true, but it points to a change in her mind in the role of religion in giving aid. More importantly, her comment points to one of the perils of bridging religious modes of action. By emphasizing sameness, they can mask inequalities in power between Americans and aid recipients. The volunteers were explicit about the power inequity between the people giving and receiving medical care. They were wary that religious expression that tried to bridge that gap could in fact be coercive. So you've seen that religion has an important role to play in do-it-yourself aid. But this volunteer's comments bring us to some of the perils of this movement. All aid programs, of course, risk misdiagnosing or oversimplifying development problems. The anthropologist James Ferguson famously described a Canadian aid agency's failed attempt to improve agricultural production in Lesotho which overlooked the fact that the region's residents were not actually farmers, but migrant laborers in South African mines. But grassroots NGOs' vulnerabilities to these errors are a bit different from larger NGOs. First, the leaders of dingoes typically know less about the local context than traditional aid agencies. Their leaders, even immigrants like Erasto, spend only weeks or months of the year in the field and instead rely on the reports of their local brokers. Many Dingo leaders have few local language skills and must rely on translators or ask the locals to speak English. Important information can be lost in translation or is unheard as Americans are deaf to the little conversations that are taking place around them. American do-it-yourselfers also usually lack the contextual knowledge of past development efforts, whether failed or successful, in their particular sites. The leader of one grassroots NGO explained to me, "We may have been reinventing the wheel, but man, it was our wheel." A related problem that comes out of the part-time relationship between American givers and the receiving communities is that grassroots aid can lack meaningful mechanisms of accountability to its clients. The primary axis of accountability, as in most nonprofit organizations, is between the organization's founders and the donors, usually friends and family, who support the projects. One of the hard-won lessons of the last 70 years of development work is that projects that are simply parachuted into a local community without meaningful local buy-in typically fail. Achieving this buy-in takes time and local knowledge and is often messy. The desire to make it our we, this high expressive quality, adds to the peril of grassroots NGOs. These organizations are launched as passion projects of the founders. Americans involved with dingoes derive deep emotional satisfaction and sometimes frustration from their efforts. But there are real risks in allowing American preferences to steer the ship. Allowing expressive impulses to flourish in an NGO requires certain accommodations. It means choosing projects that are of interest to Americans. It means allowing in foreign volunteers, even if it isn't particularly efficient, even if there's plenty of unskilled labor where you're doing work. It means constant negotiating and emotional work between outsiders' ideas and insiders' practical knowledge. One of the great perils of do-it-yourself aid is that these programs can become more about satisfying Americans' desires to be cosmopolitan, wise, or generous than about helping others gain greater well-being and self-determination. Grassroots NGOs do have some advantages in being independent from the budgets and networks of professional NGOs. Larger organizations are constantly pushed to demonstrate the results, usually using statistics, and to create projects that can be replicated. Grassroots NGOs, since they are supported by those personal networks of friends and family, are immune to these pressures. Their accountability to their donors is based on personal relationships rather than formal metrics. That gives these groups the opportunity to work deeply in a community rather than widely. And I predict that where these organizations are successful, it will be in places where they've made long-standing commitments to a particular community. But there's a final peril built into the strategy of funding an NGO with donations from family and friends. When NGO leaders explain their work in the Global South to fellow Americans, no matter how virtuously they portray their local partners, and usually they do portray them as hardworking and hospitable, these individuals are still portrayed as aid recipients. When other Americans hear the stories of do-it-yourself aid, the story centers around Americans as the protagonist, or as one critic has called it, whites in shining armor. Even when the programs on the ground are attempting meaningful partnership between Americans and local partners, this partnership is usually effaced in the discourse of fundraising, which, like all fundraising pitches, centers around a donor's willingness to act. So even while they rouse Americans' compassion, do-it-yourself aid risks calcifying Americans' existing ideas about the Global South. This is one of the ways that even as charity is becoming easier, justice gets harder. In closing, I want to inject some hope into the discussion by telling you the story of an aid do-it-yourselfer who has managed to avoid many of these perils. As a side note, do any of you have friends that make you wonder what you're doing with your life, but they're such wonderful people you can't really be mad at them? Is this familiar? Okay. So for me, Diane Coffey is that friend. The most recent winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, Angus Deaton, recently called Diane an economic Mother Teresa. With her husband, Dean, Diane established an NGO called the Research Institute for Compassionate Economics, or RICE for short. They were just funded by the Gates Foundation for $1.5 million to research sanitation in India. But the point of all this is to tell you about how someone, basically a decade older than many of you, got to that stage and how so far she has avoided many of the perils of do-it-yourself aid. Like many of you, Diane attended a religious liberal arts college, Villanova University. She studied sociology and peace and justice studies and learned Spanish. In her junior year, she spent a semester abroad in India as part of an exchange program through Minnesota Studies in International Development. Although her interest in children's well-being was piqued there, she didn't run home to start her own nonprofit. Instead, after graduation, she spent a year in the Dominican Republic living in community with the Sisters of the Holy Child Jesus. She literally lived with nuns. Do you see where the Mother Teresa reference is coming from? So these sisters accept 4 volunteers to live with them each year and help in the school and clinic that serve some of the country's poorest children. As a volunteer, Diane taught children each day in Spanish while living simply and joining the sisters twice weekly in community prayer. Already, Diane had learned 2 important lessons here. She learned that you must speak the language of the people you want to serve. And by living with these sisters, Diane saw that a sense of shock at poverty or a rush of ideas about how problems could be fixed with first world help is not enough to anchor a meaningful movement for social change. The sisters' efforts in the Dominican Republic are based on centuries of Catholic teaching about obligations to the poor. They're also rooted in the mission of their own order, which is to rejoice in God's presence and help people believe that God lives and acts in them and in our world. So here we see religious resources at their very best. The global network of the Catholic Church that connects people of faith from the US to the Dominican Republic, and a religious frame of meaning that is used not to justify the projects that aid givers already favor, but to provide a deeper ethic that guides the programs, the relationships between the aid givers and aid recipients, and that shapes the mind and spirits of the aid givers themselves. After her time with the sisters, Diane went to Princeton University, where she earned a master's degree and a PhD in public policy and demography. In other words, she developed concrete skills that would be useful to address development problems. In her studies, she soon learned that there were a number of issues about children's health where better research was needed to develop better solutions. For instance, how much of children's malnutrition can be traced to the malnourishment of their mothers during pregnancy? How much will the availability of latrines reduce child mortality? She developed the research skills to answer these questions, and then she apprenticed herself to the local experts at the Delhi School of Economics back in India. Even though by this point she was working in highly specialized demographic research and she could have spent all of her time in a nice air-conditioned office, she still believed that being able to talk with local people in their native tongue mattered, so she mastered Hindi. I said earlier that one of the great challenges of grassroots aid was making sure that your programs were tied into local institutions and were accountable to the people you're trying to serve. Diane has done that through her fellowship with the Indian University, and more importantly, by staffing the Rice Board of Directors with Indian nationals. She's told me that one of the challenges of her work is that the research sometimes has to critique the policies of the Indian government. For instance, they found that a massive effort by Hindu party-led government to build latrines hadn't actually led to a decrease in the practice of open defecation in rural areas. It turns out that even though latrines are being built, many Hindus are reluctant to use them because the latrines fill up quickly and emptying them is associated with the untouchable castes. Adopting this healthier behavior, in other words, conflicts with a long-held cultural taboo. So this problem touches 2 third rails that an NGO would typically avoid: Indian politics and sensitive cultural issues. As executive director of Rice, Diane has deferred to her Indian colleagues on these issues. They are the ones penning op-eds for Indian newspapers and giving interviews to Indian media. Rice is willing to take on politically and socially sensitive subjects, but only because they have the research to back up their position and because it is local people leading the charge, not Diane from Connecticut. I can imagine that for a compassionate young woman like Diane, it would have been very easy after college to go home to friends and family, raise several $1,000s, and return to India and start building latrines. It would have responded to the immediate suffering she saw, and she would have seen tangible evidence of her work. She could have had her wheel. But we know now that it probably would have done very little to curb open defecation or to improve rural health. Instead, Diane submitted herself to a religious discipline, then to the disciplines of demographic research and learning Hindi. The work she's doing now, as a result, has potential to change policies and improve literally millions of lives, instead of a few hundred or thousand. I'm not suggesting that all of you dispatch yourself to the Sisters of the Holy Child Jesus after graduation, or that the only way to be useful is to earn a terminal degree in demography or economics. I don't think that's true. But I do hope that those of you who wish to make a difference in communities outside of your own will heed some of Diane's lessons. Be willing to live with the people you want to help and to learn their language. Go slow and look for the source of the problems, not just the symptoms. Develop a useful skill, and then take time to learn how the academic version of that skill actually applies in the local context. And put yourself in the service of the people you want to help. You are not their fairy godmother. Angus Deaton, the very Nobel Prize-winning economist that I mentioned earlier, has described the last 300 years as a great escape from poverty, poor health, and early death. Most of us in the global north live long lives in relative comfort. But there are more than 1 billion people living in Africa, Asia, and parts of Latin America who have not yet made the escape. A wonderful and perverse thing about globalization is that it's made airplanes a kind of time machine. We can get on a plane here and in 5 hours emerge in Haiti, where levels of income and life expectancy are what they were in Europe 300 years ago. Any American who got on a plane and witnessed this would need to have a pretty cold heart, not see the injustice and want to do something about it. Yet, I want to conclude with one of the texts that recurred many times on websites to rationalize the work of grassroots NGOs. It's the story of a girl walking on a beach where thousands of starfish have washed up and would presumably die out of the water. The girl is picking up starfish and throwing them back in the water when a man comes up to her and says, "Let it go, you can't possibly make a difference when there's so many." So the girl picks up another starfish, tosses it into the water, and says, "I made a difference to that one." On one hand, this allegory makes a convincing case for particularistic, if limited, charity. But it ignores the fact that human beings are not starfish, and global inequality is not the tides. Human beings do have access, however complicated and politically difficult, to the forces that raise the fortunes of some nations while drowning the fortunes of others. However useful that they can be to individual starfish, the Americans wanting to do aid themselves should not forget about the tides.